Welcome to today's webinar, which will focus on geopolitical risk and its impact on the business environment we all operate in. Over the past decade, and especially in recent years, geopolitical risk has become increasingly relevant to our clients as they do business around the world. This year feels particularly pivotal. Events such as US elections and conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East continue to disrupt conventional understandings of the global order. Consequently, businesses face a more complex landscape to navigate than ever before. But despite this uncertainty, clients are still seeking opportunities for growth in a market as rich with opportunity as it is fraught with risk. This requires a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the risks faced than ever before and a more agile corporate mindset. Our goal as a firm is to support our clients as they seek out opportunities and navigate the risks. And today we hope to bring some fresh perspectives to this table. Helping us to do that is geopolitical risk strategist Tina Fordham. Tina has spent a large part of her career helping assess global political risk for corporates and investors, and is founder of Fordham Global Foresight. Tina will share with us today her insights on how clients can better anticipate the risks and the opportunities emerging from volatility. Then together, we'll explore some of the more pressing issues that are faced by our clients and consider where else businesses should be looking as they horizon scan for potential disruption. Tina, thank you for joining us. Let's hear your perspectives.
Thank you, Carolina, and thanks everybody for joining. We're going to talk now about the new geopolitical risk supercycle and how businesses and investors can navigate this environment. Carolina has already laid out the reasons for why we're at an inflection point this year, 2024. I haven't called my presentation tipping point because I think that there are reasons for optimism. In mathematics, inflection point refers to where a line starts to curve. And that's where we are, and I think it's a useful framing device for thinking about the signposts in the year ahead and what kind of change we can expect from them. The sense that life is coming at us fast when it comes to geopolitics is something that I hear from a lot of business leaders, and that reflects the fact that the times that we have grown up in personally and professionally, particularly the period between 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and 2008 when the global financial crisis hit, was the most peaceful and prosperous time in human history. What we are entering is a paradigm shift, as we call it in political science, a period of change. We're going to talk today a little bit about how to think about it and what to watch for, and also how to change your perspective so that you are less inclined to be surprised by downside risks and more open to the upside changes. One of the kind of plaintive questions I get a lot from executives is, when are things going to go back to normal? I think that's a good question to address head on. First of all, what is normal and when was normal? Because thinking back, we've had the global financial crisis, as mentioned, which was extremely disruptive in our industry, followed by the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now conflict in the Middle East. So are we talking about a normal that's pre-2008? And you already know the answer to this. We're not going back to whatever that normal was. There's lots of talk about the new normal. My suggestion is that we need to think about a decade of dislocation, which means change, really, and be prepared for shifts in various directions. And I'll talk to you more about what that means. I've developed a concept that I call PQ. You know about IQ, obviously, your intelligence quotient. Anyone in management has heard a lot about the need to improve your EQ and your empathy as a leader. I'm suggesting that to navigate this more complex geopolitical environment and also featuring more social change, we need to raise our PQ. And that is really meant to be shorthand for saying, you don't need to read more news. In fact, I probably would caution against that. It's not so good for your mental health. And geopolitics is not the same thing as current affairs. And so being more prepared for the changes before us have a lot to do with changing your mindset. And I think the primary takeaway there is a shift away from the assumption that everyone in the world is thinking with comparative in mind and being attuned to the idea that there are more motivating factors, and that influences who might be the winners and losers in the new environment to come. As an analytical construct, I like to take a methodology-based approach. I've written about what I call the new geopolitical risk supercycle. Supercycle is a term from astronomy, although we tend to use it in financial markets more to refer to commodities. But I think it's a useful way of thinking about the times that we're in. And this little diagram lays out the thinking. First of all, the risk drivers. These are the structural kinds of shifts that are driving the disruptions, the catalysts, the things that move markets and change share prices, but they tend not to come from out of the blue. The risk drivers are things like climate change, which causes any manner of disruption, but also moves people. And that those migration flows impact politics in developed markets, among other things. Conflicts. Lots of people ask me, is it my imagination or are there more conflicts than before? Yes, there are. Groups like the International Crisis Group track the number of conflicts, and we started to see a spike around 2012. History tells us that we tend to see these periods of a higher rate of conflict for some period of time. We like to be optimistic, but when it comes to diplomacy and resolving conflicts, the trajectory for that tends to be quite long. Other risk drivers might be political change, whether orderly through elections or less orderly through coups, social unrest, etc. All of these risk drivers, in short, are more active than they have been, so it's not our imagination. And on the other side of the equation, the buffers and the countervailing forces, there's one really important change from the past 15 years, and that is that central banks are providing less liquidity to mop up this risk. So for people who have been maybe less in the markets for less time, they haven't really experienced how geopolitical risk can be a disrupting factor, and that's thanks mainly to central banks. And on the other hand, if you're in the US, the onset of US energy independence. So these two sources of liquidity have acted as buffers. The other positive factor that can help ameliorate risks, of course, is diplomacy, international cooperation, and unfortunately, that has been in less supply as well. So this is the kind of less optimistic, but pretty granular part of the analysis. It's why I think we need to be prepared for this decade of disruption, and it's a geopolitical risk supercycle. The inflection point bit comes in whereby the decisions that will impact the scenarios, the outcomes, haven't been taken yet. And we need to be watching how those go and preparing our minds. We already know what the key drivers are for disruption right now: the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Israel and Hamas, and the knock-on effects with disruptions in Red Sea supply chains, Iran tensions, etc. China and Taiwan, that has receded somewhat. We're in a period of better relations, but still very much on a watching brief. And of course, this year, as everyone knows by now, we have more elections taking place than at any point in human history, more people going to vote. Countries like India, Mexico, very large populist democracies. Of course, the United States, here in the UK as well, European parliamentary elections. A lot of potential for regime change. On the one hand, that isn't necessarily a reflection of greater risk, but from a regulatory and a policy perspective, we may be dealing with new leaders and new public expectations. We are, of course, entering this election cycle after both the pandemic and the cost of living increases that have really impacted public opinion in a number of markets. I talk about these factors coming together in the idea of new doom loops. That's really to get your attention. But what I'm talking about is the interlinkages between factors. So that war in the Middle East, might have previously disrupted oil prices. In fact, we're not seeing that in this time, but we are seeing an impact already on public opinion in the United States, in Germany, in the UK, and that's something new. Those interlinkages and the speed with which they can transpire is something that hasn't been an issue before. And I haven't even started to talk about how AI might matter. Getting down to brass tacks, I have a monthly watch list I call the Navigator watch list, where I plot some of the specific risks that can transpire during the month ahead. And we look at them along a trajectory of priced in on the left and potentially systemic on the right. Thankfully, we're not plotting anything near the systemic risk factor side of things just yet. But the important point for me is that we have this kind of range of risk factors, a higher concentration than we've seen in the past. Any of them could become disruptive fairly quickly, and markets are quite calm about this. This too is an important disconnect to keep our eyes on. We've seen financial markets move away from being obsessed with interest rate cuts to now in the midst of a kind of a positive story about a soft landing for the global economy. That is, of course, really important, but we do have quite a number of geopolitical risks on the front burner, and they could impact the interest rate trajectory as well as global growth and other things. So we haven't seen that concentration of risks before. My motto, borrowed from Louis Pasteur, is that fortune favors the brave and chance favors the prepared mind. I personally, after 25 years in this field, had an epiphany when Russia invaded Ukraine, because in my world, I talk very often to extremely well-connected, thoughtful subject matter experts, and even they weren't prepared for Putin taking this decision to invade Ukraine. And that taught me something important about the traditional reliance that we place on access to experts, insights. I think what really matters is openness to change. And part of the reason why so many people failed to appreciate that an invasion of Ukraine might happen, or, for example, the October 7th attacks in Israel, is really a failure of imagination. And if I have one takeaway for business leaders, it's to expand the range of possibilities that you consider in your business strategy. We talked about elections everywhere. That is something that could go on for a long time. Pretty much the first question I get when I walk into a room is who's going to win the US elections. You will find that the traditional pollsters and forecasters of US elections have been pretty quiet about making a call on this one. And that reflects the fact that there are just more variables than we've ever seen before. Even though pollsters always try to reinforce the idea that polls are a snapshot of current opinion and not a forecast, people don't really cut them that much slack. There'll be, I think, a frenzy as we head into November elections in the United States. It's quite paradoxical that Donald Trump is ahead in the polls, but I would caution on coming to a conclusion of a Trump return to the White House just yet. Among the reasons that I suggest this is that the front runner this early on, and we're still 8 months away, almost never wins. We also have a president who has legal troubles, to say the least, and even though he's the bookie's favorite, he's having trouble raising funds to post his own bail. So this is a complicated run. One of the things that interests me is that here in Europe, almost everyone I talk to has already assumed that Trump is going to win. I think it's too soon to come to that conclusion, but we should all prepare for the possibility of a Trump 2.0. Meanwhile, in the world of authoritarian regimes, it wasn't that long ago that a lot of my investor clients were pretty comfortable with authoritarian regimes. Developments since then, I think, have prompted investors and business leaders to look more closely, and that a lack of data and a lack of transparency may not mean that all news is good news. In the meantime, however, we see more and more countries moving into an autocratic or semi-autocratic regime. And I think, again, the key there for business leaders is the lack of transparency. You won't know what you don't know in a regime like that. I want to end on these ideas, which we'll carry through to the Q&A session with Carolena, which is that it's not necessarily bad news to conclude that we're in a period of change. I think the idea of stability was maybe a bit of a fantasy, and the notion of convergence toward sort of Western ideals. It's a more complex environment. It's also a fascinating and dynamic environment. Carolina mentioned agility, and we're going to talk now about silver linings, preparedness, and other ways that you can be ready for what's coming next. Thanks very much for listening. Stay with us.
Hi, Tina. That was a wonderful presentation and run through of the geopolitical risks and the intersectionalities, and very helpful for us to start our conversation today. You mentioned Louis Pasteur in your presentation, and you often quote him. And I'd like to start there with preparedness and ask you how you think organizations and their C-suite can prepare themselves for the very tumultuous year ahead.
Thank you very much. I actually think this is the heart of what we need to do, whether we're thinking about geopolitical risks or social change, which I also look at, AI, ESG, DE&I, no matter what the topic is, preparedness for a wider range of possible outcomes has to be the way forward for all organizations. Of course, that's easier said than done. One of the things I've observed in my career, whether it's gender equality, which I've worked on in the past, geopolitical risk, or other topics, is that it starts from the top, which is why I think it's so important that you are leading this discussion about navigating change. A lot of business leaders really want things to go back to the way they used to be as fast as possible, because naturally that's our comfort zone. So this simple openness to the idea that things are changing, that they're evolving, some of it's out of our control, but not all of it. Even geopolitics, the way that I like to talk about it as a systemic thinker, is not merely sort of forces of nature which erupt. They are often the result of decisions taken or not taken. So part of what we need to do is to be what I call zeitgeist leaders. Zeitgeist, one of those wonderful German words, it means the spirit of the times. I also like to talk about a study that the Harvard Business Review did on zeitgeist leadership. That's where I borrowed the term. What it talked about was that the most successful executives, business leaders in history are those who managed what was thrown at them during the period of their leadership, not necessarily the ones who presided over the most growth, most revenues, the traditional indicators, but during a period of change. Well, here we are. As I discussed, we're entering a concentrated period of change. And even when we talk about things going back to normal, whether it's back to the office or back to the kind of interplay between functions, practice areas that we're used to, it's really hard to see how we can turn the clock back.
When we look ahead to 2024 and we know there are so many unforeseens that are coming, how should we be thinking about those, and what will they be?
Well, this is one of the most popular questions I get. It's often framed in terms of what are the black swans? We have black swans, we have gray rhinos. I think we have some other, animals from the zoo that are used to kind of personify this notion of these creatures that might come at us from nowhere. I think the first point I would make is that it actually doesn't happen very often that there are really unforeseen developments like black swan events, apart from, say, natural disasters. What there are risk factors that we tend to not pay much attention to. One of them was the pandemic. It isn't correct to say that nobody anticipated the pandemic. I go to Davos every year, and there are always, patient epidemiologists talking about things like pandemics. No one wanted to listen to them. And that's why I often talk about this idea of preparedness of the mind and that Louis Pasteur quote. It isn't that we should take every risk seriously, but we should look carefully at the ones where there is a material probability. And let's say that's 10 to 15%. Now that means we have more things to look at than in the past. And so thinking about unforeseen developments in 2024, I think even if we're looking at something that's getting a great deal of attention, like the US elections, where there is so much focus on what the world will look like, what the international system will look like under a Trump versus a Biden presidency, one of the points that I'm talking about quite a bit is just that in such a contested and fragmented environment, a key point just for deal flow, for example, is that this outcome, the US election outcome, isn't likely to be clear and agreed upon on November 6th, the day after US elections. And so, we would all like to be able to call the elections, and I am advising clients to be prepared for the possibility of a Trump presidency and all of the disruption that might mean for everything from the legal and regulatory environment to trade, to conflict, to the transatlantic relationship. In the very near term, be prepared for the fact that we have several months without clarity of outcome, as there are possibly Supreme Court challenges, state-level challenges, because let's remember that there's really one clear factor for democracy, and that's the loser accepting the result. In an environment where there is such low public trust in institutions, in the media, and in each other, the stakes are very high in the US elections, something that we are all spending a lot of time looking at, but perhaps not looking at in the right way. I could also flag a few other things that are on my risk radar. I know that you publish a risk radar as well. The themes that can be disrupted versus the event risks are worthy of attention. Venezuela is making noises about Guyana, where there are oil fields. I think that is something to keep an eye on. I would also be looking at evidence of consumer boycotts in the Middle East around this conflict, whereby the opinion of the public in the Middle East may diverge from the leadership and be manifested, for example, through boycotts.
And from the C-suite perspective, obviously moving the mindset beyond traditional predictions and the traditional playbooks we use around that, and talking through plausible hypotheticals?
Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue, plausible hypotheticals. But that is my suggestion for dealing with these range of scenarios. Again, it's plausible scenarios. Now, okay, that sounds fairly intuitive, but most people are taught to score risks as a 0 or a 1, very binary. They're either going to happen or they're not going to happen. And in just about every one of those kind of hotspots that we talked about, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, China-Taiwan tensions, or the Middle East, there are so many possible sources of escalation or friction that could impact the business environment, but without tipping into a full-blown conflict. Our commercial instinct says, why would anybody want to go to war? Costs human lives, it's bad for business. That's quite true, but we have to remember that leaders are going for power first, and commercial and economic opportunities in the mind of a political leader comes from the acquisition of power. For business leaders, you're going for the commercial opportunities, and that allows you to grow your market share. So it's almost an inversion of what we're used to in the business world in terms of how to understand what might drive the next wave of decisions.
I'd like to turn now to the Middle East and ask you about your thoughts about opportunities in KSA and in the Middle East generally.
Lots of interest from just about every client segment that I talk to about the Middle East, about the Gulf in particular. It's a very dynamic, very fast-growing region, young population. And also we're seeing some very interesting visionary leadership going on, whereby the governments of these countries, the leaders, understand that we've reached peak hydrocarbons, and in order to sort of deal with and meet the expectations of that young population, they want to diversify the economy. One of the things you and I have talked about before is how it's very possible, if not even highly likely, that opportunity coexists alongside friction, hostilities, and in this case, the biggest conflict between Israel and Palestinian Authority, in this case Hamas, than for 20 years. We can't ignore that. And one of the possible risks of escalation there comes from actors like Iran, the Houthi rebels, kind of taking advantage of that war to gain ground. That's to be expected. Our question needs to be whether escalation of that conflict meaningfully disrupts the trend that is happening in the Gulf states, and what might disrupt it. And so we need to be watching and monitoring. I think, though, it's just useful to kind of turn our minds back to the two Gulf wars in Iraq. At that time, I was the chief global political analyst at a big financial institution. There was lots of concern about just abandoning the Gulf altogether, the Middle East altogether. Nobody is talking that way now. And I think that that is really crucial. In order to take advantage of the opportunities, though, I think we have to have our eyes wide open and again, pay attention to possible disconnects and disruptors in the region too. I'll close that point by saying that I think the US relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states will remain a focal point for both sides. Particularly as the defense and security relationship remains very strong, very robust, and we can see this reflected through continued arms sales, for example.
And I expect those issues will be hotly debated and discussed during the election campaign.
Yes, but as much as this is a highly contested U.S. election campaign, and in every election campaign, the two parties in this case are at great pains to emphasize the differences between their approaches. Historically, foreign policy, trade policy, security policy hasn't really changed that dramatically from one leader to the next. And so with that in mind, I am comfortable saying that I think the U.S. relationship with the Middle East, particularly with the GCC states, will be strong. U.S. relationship with Israel is in a difficult place, although I think that that is more a personal tension between the White House and the Israeli Prime Minister, and that could change over time. That's been a very solid relationship for a very long time.
You mentioned hydrocarbons, and clients are very interested in talking about energy transition with us. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Again, highly complex. If you're in the United States where there's energy independence, it's a different conversation. We here in Europe are still largely energy importers, plus we have a kind of a stronger commitment, let's say, to net zero and everything else. And I think that's shared across the political spectrum in Europe, which again makes it different from the US example. And on this front, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a really important example of how something happened which was considered unthinkable, that not only that Russia would invade a neighboring sovereign state, but also that it would put at risk the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which people have been working on for a very long time and was part of the German strategy of trade through interdependence. A great example of how states do things that are not in their rational economic self-interest. But the reason why it was considered unthinkable was that certainly the revenues for Russia were so great, but that Europe was thought to not be able to survive such a disruption? Well, Europe did survive that disruption. Norway helped quite a bit, and the economic shock that was expected really didn't materialize. So for me, that's a reminder that we should always, stress test the downside scenarios too. It hasn't been painless, certainly, for Europe to have to make do without Russian energy supplies. But I think one of the unintended consequences, we could even call it a silver lining, has been it's accelerated the move away from traditional sources of energy and efforts to make this part of the policy agenda.
Talking through some of these geopolitical issues with you, Tina, obviously there are short-term disruption and consequences. As you scan ahead, what are your thoughts about the long-term consequences of many of the events that are taking place today?
There's so many things I want to say and so little time to say it, so I'll try to be very concise. I think one is, the end of what political scientists like me call the Pax Americana. That's the kind of sole superpower moment, convergence in the financial system and institutions. We know that has ended. We don't know what will come next precisely, but it's pretty clear that it's going to involve a kind of, whether it's a rebalancing or even a constantly shifting balance of power between these new rising middle powers. That, to me, is an obvious one. There's a great temptation to make bets on certain countries being winners and losers. As you already know, I don't really like those kind of very binary constructs. But I think what we can see from these rising middle powers is, among other trends, that India and Saudi Arabia, I think, are managing this rebalancing quite well. They are managing to maintain good relations with the United States, which they consider to be important economically, but also really important from a security and defense perspective. And they are maintaining optionality with their sort of regional relationships as well. Not all countries are managing that tension so effectively. I think South Africa and Brazil are in a different place. There's something in the in history, from the Cold War era, the so-called non-aligned movement. The Russia-Ukraine conflict reactivated that reflex. But again, I think that's part of the past. And countries that can work with a range of partners and maintain continuity are going to succeed the most in this very competitive environment. Having said that, I think the BRICS construct that is talked about so much isn't going to become a meaningful rival to the G7 because these countries have very different interests and are not going to act in concert. One of the specific examples is the India-China rivalry, the IC in BRICS. They are in competition. They are not likely to embrace, policy developments that will, necessarily advantage one over the other. What they have in common is they would like to see the U.S. Less powerful in the global order. So understanding what motivates countries is super important in this environment.
You made a comment about people losing confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court as one of the consequences of various events that have taken place. When we look at our sort of democratic institutions, what are your thoughts about the long-term consequence of us losing confidence in some of those institutions? And what, if any, role do you think business can play in helping us to stabilize that?
That is a great question. One of the trends that emerged during the pandemic, which is really notable, was that business leaders ended up, for the first time since the financial crisis, being the most trusted out of the media, the courts, and others. Of course, that has also brought about quite a bit of pressure on business leaders, including to take positions on issues that traditionally they haven't, political issues, social issues, and everything else. That's probably another conversation. It's something that leaders are contending with. But they were able to act more quickly, to give guidance, and respond to events in a way that employees and customers and clients found very useful. I say, go with that. If I'm right, we are in for a period where governments are pulled in a lot of directions, and they don't have the kind of legitimacy or majority that allows them to undertake the kinds of reforms that markets might like to have.
So I'm going to mix it up now, Tina, with some quick fire questions to talk about some of the issues that our clients are raising with us all the time and get your perspective. So the first question is AI good for business?
Good for business, not so good for humanity, unless we're thoughtful about how we deploy it.
Okay. Will the United States leave NATO?
I don't think the US will formally leave NATO. It did happen once. France left NATO at one point and then came back in. But what could happen is funding and other arrangements could be altered if Trump returns to the White House, which is something that he has made clear.
Okay. South China Sea or Red Sea, which will have greater impact in 2024?
What's happening on the oceans is actually paramount in 2024, and this is kind of taking us back to, the time of naval rivalries and competitiveness. Maybe a bit of a surprise, giving supply chains, old school supply chains being as important as they are. Which is going to be more important? I think that the Red Sea has more disruption right now than the South China Sea, but we should also be expecting an increase in military exercises in the South China Sea as a kind of a show of force from China, with a corresponding response from US and treaty allies in Asia.
I'm going to pick up on something you mentioned, populism. If you look ahead to 2024, are we going to be more or less populist by the end of 2024?
Populism is something that I think people often misunderstand what it means. It doesn't mean popular. It's based on a kind of a construct that says the people know best, the elites don't know best. It's always, I think, quite amusing and surprising and a little bit unsettling when elites tend to say that they're not elite. And it takes us away from what democracy is supposed to be, which is not majoritarian. It's not a consumer model that says, well, I voted for you, and so I get exactly what I wanted. It's supposed to be about leadership and decisions taken on behalf of the people. Having said that, I think the appeal in a time when there is such high dissatisfaction, particularly in the developed world, with the status quo, it is going to be very tempting for people to cast their vote for protest parties, and that includes populist parties. I think the areas to watch are going to be the flashpoints of immigration and anti-green policies. This is what European populist parties have used to their advantage, and there's some evidence of this in the United States as well. Because what we see is this kind of cognitive dissonance around climate change policies, where people say, I'm worried about climate change, but at the same time, they don't want to change their boiler. They don't want to, give up on their cars if they're extra polluting. They don't necessarily want the cost to be passed on to them. That's going to be a really difficult balance for mainstream policymakers to maintain. How do we pay for this transition that everyone knows and acknowledges needs to happen when there's so much pushback to the policy measures that will make it? There will be actors who try to take advantage of that. I suppose if there's good news is that they often don't do very well in office once they get there, because they tend to be campaigning on these protest ideas, and that's hard to govern with.
What advice would you give to a C-suite leader running a mindset reset for geopolitical risk?
This is a great question. So first of all, any C-suite leader who is even moving toward a mindset reset is doing the right thing, which is sending a message to the team and the staff that we're going to be open to ideas and debate. That doesn't happen so frequently as it might. And if there was ever a time to be open to discussion, I would say it's now, because a lot of the old kind of standbys from, from business school and from the business and economic environment that we grew up with, as discussed, have been kind of made obsolete, but not necessarily replaced by a different concept. Hence, this reflex to turn back the clock to the way things used to be. So what are the new rules? What are the new ways of doing things? They're very much in transition and they're really evolving. But no matter what the corporate objective is, the tone is set from the top. And that's very clear. In the United States, we've seen backlash to the ESG and DE&I agenda. That's political backlash, by the way. I think business leaders themselves pretty intuitively accept the logic of diverse teams and diverse perspectives. It's always, the proof is in the pudding. How do we go about achieving that? Because, on the one hand, corporates talk about singular focus on profits, on the bottom line. How do you have a laser-like focus if you're also, doing what I'm suggesting, which is surveying the landscape? This is going to be a new sort of balancing act for anybody with a global presence and anybody, frankly, with a team spanning a few generations. Younger people, I have teenagers, you'll be working with younger partners, might be in their 30s, and then the interns and people joining even younger. Very different perspectives and expectations of the way that things should work. I've observed that geopolitics, if I'm having a private conversation, invariably leads to conversations about managing diverse teams and everything else. I would say for leaders, asking questions and initiating these kinds of exercises, albeit structured, they should be trying to answer specific questions about the way the business strategy might evolve. Has to be part of the new plan. Whatever might happen from a policy and legislative perspective on ESG and DE&I, people know when these are box-ticking exercises or when the leadership takes them seriously and really wants to hear from people from different perspectives.
Last question. Our time has gone so quickly, but it's an interesting one. We've been talking a lot with our clients about these events and talking through the issues and how they relate to their business. And we've talked a lot about how they can build a toolkit in order to have good discussions and beneficial discussions for their strategy and for the opportunities that they'd like to pursue. So I wonder if we could get some advice from you as to how to build that toolkit and what they should be thinking about and the things that they should be doing to get ready for the year ahead.
Sure. I have put together my thoughts on a toolkit, which in a way I hope puts me out of business eventually, because geopolitical risk has been kind of a dark art for a very long time, something that ex-statesmen, diplomats, and others would advise companies about. Retired generals, really they're kind of inside observations about working with heads of state and that sort of thing. My approach is quite different. First of all, I think that we can all do a better job of building our confidence and our capacity to think about global forces, and that is expressed through this PQ idea. You don't need to become an expert, although I still hope you call upon experts because that long-term perspective can be valuable. But to build out capacity and to have these open conversations. I think something that in my career I've only really started to see since the pandemic is more humility from the C-suite. Asking questions and debating ideas. I try to do this in my board conversations. Normally an expert like me would come in and tell you, here's what's going to happen with a high degree of confidence. I think we need to start all of these conversations with a question. What are we thinking right now? What are our colleagues in different geographies thinking, in different practice areas? Let's bring together all of those views and try to weight them into a business strategy. The risk function has always been quite separate. Risk people are never the most fun people in the organization. They're the people who tell you no. I think we need to put to sort of think about business strategy through the lens of geopolitical risk, among other things. And that even comes back to people and talent retention and everything else, because what's happening in the world, geopolitics has become personal for people in a way that many of us aren't used to, particularly if we come from a rich industrialized democracy. Wars were things that happened far away. Sanctions didn't impact us. It's hard to find anyone who doesn't feel personally affected by recent developments in some way. That is an additional challenge, but it's also an opportunity to connect with people and to listen. So if I were to bring it all together, I think the PQ framework, the zeitgeist leadership, which is understanding the spirit of the times rather than wanting to find ways to turn the clock back, and listening and asking questions, more sources of information, are probably the factors that will lead to having that prepared mind to take advantage of opportunities and be less surprised by downside risks.
That's great advice, Tina, and thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
As geopolitical issues continue to shape our business world, it is critical for organizations to consider the plausible hypotheticals and the risks carefully, as Tina mentioned. It's a complex situation, but Tina's advice to stay curious, open-minded, and prepared is invaluable. Even in a world that seems more volatile and unpredictable than ever, there are opportunities available to grow for those who are prepared. At Clyde Co, our sector specialists stand ready to help you to explore those opportunities and navigate the risks together. Thank you for joining us today.